Before we go any further, consider a possibility that sounds deeply unsettling. What if one of the most liberating truths in existence is that the universe does not care about you at all? Most people assume the opposite. They assume that meaning is something out there waiting to be discovered. That life makes sense if you look hard enough. That suffering must fit into some larger plan. That success, failure, love, loss, and every decision you make somehow matter to a grand cosmic story. But what if there is no ground audience watching? What if there is no hidden script, no final explanation, no guarantee that the universe will ever tell you why you're here? At first, that sounds terrifying. In fact, for many people, it is the nightmare beneath every other fear. Not the fear of failure. Not the fear of death. But the fear that existence itself may be silent. Imagine standing beneath a sky filled with billions of stars. Light from distant galaxies travels millions of years across space before reaching your eyes. Entire worlds are born and destroyed without ever knowing you existed. And yet every morning, most of us wake up carrying invisible expectations. Expectations that life should make sense. That the universe should provide answers. That somehow we deserve certainty. But here is the contradiction. The more desperately we demand certainty, the less free we become. Think about that. If your meaning depends on something outside yourself, society, destiny, success, approval, even some cosmic guarantee, then your freedom is always conditional. You are always waiting for permission. Always waiting for validation. Always waiting for the universe to tell you that you are on the right path. And what if that permission never comes? This is where the real mystery begins. Because history is filled with people who spent their lives searching for signs, searching for purpose, searching for proof that their existence mattered. Yet the most influential voices in philosophy arrived at a deeply uncomfortable observation: the universe remains silent. Not hostile. Not cruel. Not compassionate. Silent. And strangely, that silence may be the most important revelation of all. Because if the universe is not judging you, then who is holding the pen that writes your life? If the stars do not care whether you succeed or fail, what exactly is stopping you from choosing your own direction? This is where many people turn away. Because they discover something unexpected hiding beneath the fear of meaninglessness. Responsibility. A universe that doesn't care about you removes more than comfort. It removes excuses. Suddenly there is no cosmic referee to blame. No predetermined role to hide behind. No destiny to rescue you from difficult choices. The burden returns to where it has always belonged. To you. And that realization creates one of the strangest paradoxes in human existence. The very thing that appears to diminish your significance may actually be the thing that gives you the greatest freedom you will ever experience. But if that is true, then a much larger question emerges. Maybe the real problem was never that the universe failed to give us meaning. Maybe the real problem is that we've spent our entire lives expecting it to. If the universe never promised you meaning, then why do so many people feel betrayed when they fail to find it? That question reveals something deeper than existential anxiety. It reveals an expectation. An expectation so old and so deeply embedded in human consciousness that most of us never notice it. We assume that meaning should exist before we arrive. That purpose should be discovered, not created. That somewhere behind the chaos, there must be a hidden structure waiting to be revealed. But what if that assumption is the source of the conflict itself? Notice what happens when people lose a career they built their identity around. Or when a relationship ends. Or when a lifelong goal finally arrives, only to leave behind an unexpected emptiness. The pain is often larger than the event itself. Why? Because something invisible has collapsed with it. A story. A story about who they thought they were. A story about where life was supposed to lead. A story about how the universe was supposed to reward effort with certainty. And when that story breaks, people often conclude that life has lost meaning. But that conclusion hides a contradiction. Did meaning disappear? Or did an expectation disappear? Those are not the same thing. This is where the conflict becomes far more interesting. Because the human mind is a meaning-making machine. It connects patterns. It creates narratives. It transforms random events into personal significance. We do it naturally. Constantly. Almost automatically. Yet at the same time, we demand that meaning come from somewhere outside ourselves. We want freedom. But we also want instructions. We want autonomy. But we also want guarantees. And those desires quietly pull against each other every day. Imagine standing before a massive doorway stretching into darkness. No signs. No map. No voice telling you which direction to take. Most people call that uncertainty. Some call it fear. But there is another possibility. What if that doorway is freedom itself? The strange thing about freedom is that it rarely feels liberating at first. It feels like responsibility. It feels like ambiguity. It feels like standing alone beneath a sky that refuses to answer your questions. That is why so many people spend their lives searching for certainty rather than seeking truth. Certainty is comforting. Truth is often unsettling. And the truth may be that the universe has never been withholding meaning from us. Perhaps it was never offering it in the first place. That realization changes the role of the individual completely. The central figure in this conflict is no longer a victim searching for answers from an indifferent cosmos. The central figure becomes a creator. Someone who must decide what matters without cosmic approval. Someone who must choose values without guarantees. Someone who must act without knowing whether the universe agrees. And suddenly the scale shifts. This is no longer a philosophical question. It becomes a question about every choice you make. Every relationship. Every ambition. Every sacrifice. Because if no ultimate authority is assigning significance, then significance emerges from commitment itself. But that insight creates an even deeper mystery. If meaning is not discovered but created, why do so many people instinctively resist that freedom? Why? Does the absence of a script feel less frightening to some people and more terrifying to others? And what if the greatest burden in human life is not meaninglessness at all, but the realization that no one else can decide what your life is for? Before we can understand what freedom really costs, we have to confront a possibility that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What if meaning is not the thing we are searching for? What if meaning is the thing we use to avoid something even more frightening? Because there is a hidden contradiction buried inside the human desire for purpose. We often describe purpose as liberation. A guiding star. A reason to get out of bed in the morning. A force that gives direction to our lives. But purpose can also become a shelter. And shelters have a strange habit of becoming prisons. Think about how often people ask questions that sound philosophical on the surface but are actually requests for certainty. What am I supposed to do with my life? What is my true calling? What was I meant to become? These questions seem innocent. Yet beneath them lies a deeper assumption. The assumption that somewhere, somehow, there exists a correct answer. A predefined role. A hidden script. A destination already chosen. And if that script exists, then something remarkable happens. Freedom begins to disappear. Because if your purpose has already been determined, then your responsibility shrinks. Your choices become less significant. Your uncertainty becomes easier to tolerate because the burden of authorship has been transferred elsewhere. This is the crisis hiding beneath the search for meaning. The more desperately we seek certainty, the more willingly we surrender freedom. And this contradiction does not stop at the level of individuals. It scales upward. Entire societies are built upon systems that promise certainty. Political movements. Ideologies. Religions. Social identities. Cultural narratives. None of these are inherently wrong. They can provide stability, belonging, and guidance. But they can also become something else. A substitute for uncertainty. A way to escape the terrifying reality that nobody can completely remove. Ambiguity from existence. This is why the conflict we are exploring is larger than philosophy. It is civilizational. Human beings have always attempted to place themselves inside a story large enough to explain suffering. When crops failed, civilizations searched for meaning. When disasters struck, they searched for meaning. When empires rose and collapsed, they searched for meaning. The pattern repeats across centuries because uncertainty feels unbearable. Yet there is another possibility hiding in plain sight. Perhaps uncertainty is not a flaw in reality. Perhaps it is reality. Imagine once again that empty throne. The throne of destiny. The throne of ultimate authority. The throne we secretly hope is occupied by something capable of explaining everything. Now imagine discovering that it has been empty all along. Most people assume that realization would produce despair. But would it? Or would it expose something we have been unwilling to admit? That much of what we call meaning is actually dependence. Dependence on certainty. Dependence on approval. Dependence on external validation. And here the contradiction becomes sharper. The individual who demands absolute meaning often becomes trapped by it. The individual who accepts uncertainty gains room to move. One becomes dependent upon answers. The other becomes capable of action despite the absence of answers. This is why the central figure in our story is not a victim of an indifferent cosmos. It is a rebel. Not a rebel against society. Not a rebel against nature. A rebel against the demand that reality provide guarantees before life can begin. That rebellion changes everything. Because the question is no longer, what is the meaning of life? The question becomes, why do we believe we need an answer before we allow ourselves to live? And hidden inside that shift is a revelation that many people miss. The opposite of meaninglessness may not be meaning. The opposite of meaninglessness may be courage. The courage to act without certainty. The courage to create without permission. The courage to move forward while the universe remains completely silent. But if that is true, then an even deeper mystery emerges. Why did one writer look at that silence and discover not despair, but freedom? And what did he see in a man endlessly pushing a stone uphill that transformed one of the oldest symbols of punishment into something entirely different? Here is where the symbol changes its meaning. Most people look at the image of a man pushing a stone uphill and see only futility. They see repetition. They see defeat. They see a life trapped inside an endless cycle. But what if that interpretation misses the most important detail? What if the stone was never the true subject of the story? What if the mountain was never the problem? The deeper revelation is that the central conflict is not between a man and a task. It is between consciousness and expectation. The stone is only a symbol. The mountain is only a stage. The real drama unfolds inside the mind that finally stops demanding a different reality. This is the insight that changes everything. Human suffering is often explained as the result of pain, failure, uncertainty, or loss. Yet those experiences alone do not fully explain why some people break while others grow stronger. The hidden variable is resistance. The gap between reality and the version of reality we believe we deserve. The larger that gap becomes, the more energy is consumed fighting what already exists. And this is precisely why the figure pushing the stone becomes so important. His role is not to represent punishment. His influence comes from exposing a question every human being eventually faces. What happens when reality refuses to negotiate? What happens when the universe does not adjust itself to your preferences, your plans, your expectations, or your hopes? Most people spend years attempting to solve that problem by changing the world around them. More money. More status. More certainty. More control. Yet there is a contradiction hidden inside that pursuit. The more control we demand from reality, the more vulnerable we become to everything we cannot control. Suddenly freedom depends on circumstances. Peace depends on outcomes. Meaning depends on success. The result is a fragile existence built upon conditions that can disappear overnight. This is why the revelation is larger than any individual life. It scales upward into entire societies. Civilizations become obsessed with prediction. Systems become obsessed with certainty. Cultures become obsessed with optimization. Everyone is searching for the final formula that will eliminate uncertainty forever. Yet uncertainty remains. Change remains. Mortality remains. The silence remains. And that silence reveals something unexpected. The absence of guarantees is not evidence that life lacks value. It may be the condition that makes value possible in the first place. Consider a blank canvas. Its power comes precisely from the fact that nothing has been predetermined. Consider an empty road stretching beyond the horizon with no signposts in sight. Most people see confusion. Yet hidden inside that image is possibility. The same principle applies to existence itself. The empty throne of destiny. The unanswered sky. The stone rolling downward once again. These are not merely symbols of limitation. They are symbols of authorship. They suggest that meaning cannot be handed down like a set of instructions. It emerges through participation. Through choice. Through commitment. Through action. And this leads us toward a far more unsettling realization. Perhaps the most important question was never whether life has meaning. Perhaps the more dangerous question is this: if meaning is not something we discover but something we create, then what exactly gives our creations legitimacy, and why do some meanings feel more real than others? Here we arrive at the point where the entire structure turns inside out. The question is no longer whether life contains meaning. The question is why we assumed meaning needed external authorization in the first place. This is the insight hidden beneath the symbol of the stone, beneath the silent sky, beneath the empty throne that has followed us throughout this journey. The deepest revelation is not that the universe lacks a plan for you. The deepest revelation is that your value was never dependent on a plan at all. Most people unconsciously treat meaning as if it were a natural resource buried somewhere in reality, waiting to be discovered by the fortunate or the wise. They imagine purpose as a treasure hidden behind the correct philosophy, the correct achievement, the correct belief system, or the correct life path. But that assumption creates a permanent dependency. If meaning must be found, then you remain a seeker. If meaning must be granted, then you remain a recipient. If meaning exists somewhere outside yourself, then your existence remains subject to forces beyond your control. The central figure we have been following refuses that arrangement. The rebel is not someone who discovers a secret answer. The rebel is someone who recognizes that waiting for an answer has become the obstacle itself. This is why the stone becomes such a powerful memory fragment. It represents a task that cannot justify itself through a final reward. There is no finish line waiting to validate the effort. No cosmic certificate of approval. No ultimate confirmation that the struggle was worth it. And yet the effort continues. Not because the universe demands it. Not because destiny requires it. But because the individual chooses it. That choice changes the entire architecture of meaning. Meaning is no longer something extracted from reality. Meaning becomes something projected into reality through commitment. Through participation. Through creation. Through responsibility. This is what many people overlook when they encounter the idea of absurdity. They assume the conclusion is hopelessness because they focus on what has been removed. They focus on the disappearance of guarantees. They focus on the collapse of certainty. But the true transformation occurs when attention shifts toward what has been returned. Agency. Ownership. Creative power. The ability to determine what deserves your time, your effort, your loyalty, and your life. The consequence is enormous. A person who no longer expects reality to justify their existence becomes extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. Fear loses some of its power. Approval loses some of its power. Social comparison loses some of its power. The endless race to prove one's significance begins to look different when significance is understood as something lived rather than awarded. Now scale this insight beyond the individual. Entire cultures are shaped by the meanings people create together. Every institution, every tradition, every movement, every achievement begins as an act of collective meaning-making. Human civilization itself can be viewed as a response to silence. Not a discovery of predetermined purpose, but an ongoing act of creation performed in the absence of certainty. And perhaps that is the deepest paradox of all. The universe may remain indifferent. The stars may offer no explanation. The empty throne may remain empty forever. Yet precisely because nothing guarantees meaning, every act of meaning becomes more significant, not less. But if value emerges through creation rather than discovery, then a larger consequence begins to appear. What kind of responsibility follows when there is no higher authority left to carry the burden of defining how a life should be lived? The moment responsibility returns, the real consequences begin. Not because life becomes darker, but because it becomes unmistakably yours. Many people imagine that freedom is the reward at the end of a philosophical journey. What they rarely anticipate is the weight that arrives alongside it. Once meaning is understood as something that must be created rather than received, there is no longer a safe place to hide from choice. Every day becomes an act of authorship. Every commitment becomes a declaration of value. Every refusal becomes just as significant as every decision. This is the price hidden inside freedom. The absence of external certainty does not remove responsibility. It multiplies it. And that consequence changes the role of the individual forever. The seeker who spent years looking outward is transformed into something else. Not a person who possesses ultimate answers, but a person willing to live without them. That distinction matters. Because the legacy of this idea was never certainty. Its legacy was courage. The courage to continue despite ambiguity. The courage to commit despite impermanence. The courage to build despite knowing that everything built will eventually pass away. This is why the image of the stone endures. Not because it represents endless labor, but because it represents conscious participation. Every morning the stone waits. Every morning the choice returns. And every morning the individual must answer the same question again. What deserves my effort today? That question reaches far beyond philosophy. It shapes careers, relationships, communities, entire civilizations. Because societies are ultimately collections of meanings people choose to share. Look closely at any culture and you will find stories powerful enough to organize millions of lives. Stories about success. Stories about identity. Stories about progress. Stories about what makes a life worthwhile. Yet none of these stories arrive from the stars. Human beings create them. Human beings sustain them. Human beings pass them on. And that realization produces a profound shift in perspective. The empty throne remains empty. Yet civilization continues. The sky remains silent. Yet people continue to love, build, teach, create, and sacrifice. The universe offers no applause. Yet meaning appears everywhere. This is the legacy often overlooked by those who focus only on the absence of cosmic answers. The absence itself became the condition that forced humanity to become creative. To become responsible. To become self-defining. The consequence extends even further. Many modern anxieties can be understood through this lens. The pressure to find the perfect purpose. The fear of choosing the wrong path. The obsession with comparison. The constant search for validation. All of them assume that somewhere there exists a final standard capable of settling the question once and for all. But what if life was never designed to provide that final confirmation? What if uncertainty is not a temporary obstacle but a permanent feature of existence? Suddenly the goal changes. The goal is no longer to eliminate uncertainty. The goal becomes learning how to move through it. This is where the deepest memory fragment returns. A solitary figure beneath an infinite night sky. Billions of stars overhead. No message. No instructions. No guarantee. And yet the figure keeps walking. Not because the road has been explained. Not because the destination is certain. But because movement itself becomes an expression of meaning. And perhaps that leaves us with the most difficult paradox of all. If human beings are capable of creating significance in a universe that offers none, then is meaning something fragile that exists only in our minds? Or have we underestimated the possibility that the act of creating meaning is itself one of the most important realities in existence? Perhaps the lasting importance of this idea has very little to do with philosophy and far more to do with what it reveals about being human. Across centuries, people have looked toward the horizon searching for an answer large enough to quiet every doubt. They have searched in religion, in achievement, in ideology, in knowledge, in progress, and in the promise that somewhere beyond the next discovery there waits a final explanation capable of making everything fit together. And yet the most enduring image that remains is not an answer. It is a figure continuing forward. A road without certainty. A sky without instructions. A life that must still be lived. What survives is not certainty. What survives is the capacity to respond. That may be the deepest legacy of all. Not the promise that existence will become easier. Not the promise that confusion will disappear. But the realization that human beings possess a remarkable ability to create direction even when no direction is guaranteed. This is why the symbols we have encountered continue to resonate long after the argument itself is forgotten. The silent night sky. The empty throne. The stone waiting at the bottom of the mountain. None of them offer comfort in the traditional sense. Yet each of them points toward the same insight. They force us to confront the space where responsibility and freedom meet. And in that space, something uniquely human emerges. Choice. Not perfect knowledge. Not absolute certainty. Choice. The ability to decide what deserves our attention. What deserves our loyalty. What deserves our limited time on this earth. Because in the end, a human life is not measured only by what happens to us. It is measured by what we continually choose to affirm despite uncertainty. That is why this question remains relevant far beyond any single book, philosophy, or era. Modern life surrounds us with information, opinions, predictions, and endless competing visions of what matters. Yet beneath all of that noise, the same ancient challenge remains. How should a person live when no final authority can remove the burden of deciding? Every generation inherits that question. Every individual must answer it. And every answer becomes part of the world that future generations inherit. Perhaps that is why the silence at the center of existence feels so strange. We often assume silence means absence. But silence can also mean openness. A space not yet filled. A page not yet written. A future not yet chosen. The stars remain distant. The throne remains empty. The road continues beyond the edge of sight. And somehow, none of those things diminish the significance of a human life. They may be the very conditions that make significance possible. Because if everything were already decided, creation would be unnecessary. If every answer were already known, wisdom would be unnecessary. If every purpose were already assigned, freedom would be unnecessary. And so the question that remains is not whether the universe will ever explain itself. The question is whether a life gains its deepest value from receiving meaning, or from having the courage to create it in the first place. And perhaps the most important thing is that the answer can never be given to us. It can only be lived.